Welcome back, everyone, to Rambling Dan Rose Deep Dive Book Reviews. We're glad to have you with us. Today, we're taking a look at Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military.
Oh, that's the one that's been causing quite a stir.
Exactly. It's been making waves and sparking a lot of debate.
I can see why. It's dealing with some really sensitive topics, especially when it comes to ideology and the potential impact, on American society.
Yeah, and what makes this deep dive even more fascinating is the author himself, Matthew Lohmeier.
Right, he's not just some armchair commentator. Lohmeier is a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Space Force.
Exactly. He's coming at this from a really unique perspective, from within the very institution that he believes is being influenced by Marxist ideology.
That definitely adds a different layer to his analysis, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It makes his arguments all the more compelling and thought-provoking, especially since he's drawing on his own firsthand experiences and observations.
And it sounds like he's pretty concerned about what he's seeing.
Oh, absolutely. He's sounding the alarm, you could say. He structures the book as a journey, taking us from the greatness of the American ideal as he sees it to the dangers of Marxist ideology.
And ultimately how that ideology might be influencing the U.S. military.
Right, so let's jump right into Chapter 1, Resurrecting the Ministry of Truth. This is where Lohmeier really goes after the 1619 Project.
Ah, yes, that was a pretty significant project from the New York Times, even won a Pulitzer Prize.
It did, and their goal was to reframe American history, making slavery the central theme.
If I remember correctly, they argued that 1619, the year the first slaves were brought to America, was the real founding of the nation.
Exactly. And while Lohmeier acknowledges the horrors and the lasting impact of slavery, he really pushes back against this interpretation.
He sees it as more than just bad history, doesn't he?
He does. He goes so far as to call it propaganda, and dangerous propaganda at that. Lohmeier believes it's meant to sow division and resentment within American society.
He even compares the 1619 Project to the Ministry of Truth from George Orwell's 1984.
That's right. He's making a very strong comparison there. The Ministry of Truth, for those who haven't read the book, was responsible for controlling information and rewriting history.
So Lohmeier is essentially saying that historical revisionism can be a tool for manipulation.
Precisely. He argues that it can be used to shape public perception and ultimately control the narrative.
That's pretty thought-provoking, and it really connects to his concerns about Marxist ideology, doesn't it?
It does. He believes that the 1619 Project is part of a larger effort to undermine America's core principles and ideals. The ones laid out in the Declaration of Independence.
The principles of liberty, equality, self-governance.
Right, those founding principles. And to back up his argument, he brings up the 1776 Commission.
Oh, the one established by President Trump as a counter to the 1619 Project.
That's the one. It was formed to promote patriotic education and a more, let's say, traditional view of American history.
And Lohmeier seems to be a fan of the 1776 Commission's report.
He praises it for focusing on those founding principles. And he thinks they took a more balanced approach when addressing the complexities and the tragedies, of America's past.
But of course, the 1776 Commission didn't last long.
Nope. As Lohmeier points out, it was abolished almost immediately by the Biden administration when they took office.
Which Lohmeier sees as further evidence of an ideological agenda at play.
He does. He sees a deliberate attempt to suppress certain narratives about American history.
It's a tricky situation, isn't it? I mean, Lohmeier is a military officer. He's bound by certain restrictions when it comes to political commentary.
He is, but you can tell he feels very strongly about this. He chose to use his book as a platform to voice his concerns, even if it meant risking his career.
So it's clear he believes these issues are incredibly important enough to risk everything.
Exactly, and that sense of urgency really comes through in his writing.
All right, so we've seen how Lohmeier takes on the 1619 Project, but how does he frame the American ideal itself?
That's where Chapter 2 comes in, A City Upon a Hill. This is where he really dives into those philosophical foundations and contrasts them with what he sees as the dangers of Marxist ideology.
Makes sense. You have to understand what he's defending before you can grasp the threat, right?
Right, and he starts by bringing in Thomas Jefferson's letter to Roger C. Waitman.
Wasn't that written just a couple of weeks before Jefferson died?
It was, and in it, he really eloquently sums up the enduring significance of the Declaration of Independence and those core principles that it embodies.
Those principles being?
Liberty, equality, and government by consent of the governed.
Ah, the cornerstones of the American experiment.
Exactly, and Lohmeier emphasizes that the Declaration wasn't just a document. It was a revolutionary act, a bold rejection of the old world order.
Rejection of monarchy, the divine right of kings, all of that.
All of that, and Lohmeier argues that this foundation of American self-governance is under attack today.
Under attack
By ideologies that seek to replace equality of opportunity, that classic American ideal, with forced equality of outcome.
Interesting. So he sees a fundamental shift in the understanding of what equality means.
He does. He sees a move away from individual liberty, individual responsibility, and meritocracy, which he believes are essential to the American experiment.
And to illustrate his point, he uses that powerful metaphor, a city upon a hill.
Yes, a phrase borrowed from John Winthrop's famous sermon. It's this idea of America as a shining example, a beacon of liberty for the world to see.
A model for others to follow.
Exactly. And Lohmeier dives into this concept of American exceptionalism. He even quotes from other authors like Mark Levin and Robert Riley.
What books are those?
Levin's book is called Rediscovering Americanism, and Riley's is America on Trial, a defense of the founding. They both explore the historical and philosophical roots of American exceptionalism.
So Lohmeier is building a case for the uniqueness and the importance of the American experiment.
He is, and he's arguing that this experiment is fragile, that it needs to be protected.
Protected from what exactly?
From these encroaching ideologies, from the forces that he believes are trying to undermine those core principles.
So how does he see the Constitution fitting into all of this?
That's where he transitions next. He emphasizes the vital role of the Constitution as a framework, a way of preserving those principles enshrined in the Declaration.
It's like the rules of the game, so to speak.
Exactly, and he uses that great analogy from Abraham Lincoln, describing the Constitution as a silver frame for the golden apple of the Declaration.
So it's there to protect and support those core ideals.
Right, to safeguard the American experiment. And Lohmeier even quotes President Calvin Coolidge from a speech he gave on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration.
What was Coolidge's main point in that speech?
He was underscoring the timeless and universal nature of those principles outlined in the Declaration, arguing that they're just as relevant today as they were back then.
It sounds like Lohmeier is building a pretty solid foundation for his argument here.
He is. He's laying out his view of the American ideal, its historical and philosophical roots, and the threats he perceives.
And he ends this chapter with a pretty profound question.
He does. He asks, can we, as individuals and as a nation, truly live up to the high ideals set forth by the founders?
It's a question that challenges us to look inward, to examine our own commitment to those principles.
It is, and it leads us right into Chapter 3, The Burden of Egypt, where Lohmeier gets much more personal.
Oh, how so?
This is where he starts sharing his own experiences within the U.S. military, his encounters with what he believes to be Marxist ideology creeping into the ranks.
That's a pretty bold claim. I'm curious to hear what he has to say.
Well, he starts with this anecdote about a chaplain who requests office space in his squadron.
Seems innocuous enough.
It does, but the chaplain also wants to conduct Race in America classes.
Ah, now it gets a bit more interesting. That's a pretty loaded topic, especially in today's climate.
It is, and Lohmeier admits that he felt hesitant about this request. He was worried about potential division and tension within his unit.
Makes sense. The military relies on unity, on a shared sense of purpose.
Exactly. So Lohmeier decides to meet with the chaplain, to get a better understanding of his perspective.
And what does he find?
What he hears troubles him. The chaplain expresses the view that America was founded by racists and that American history needs to be completely rewritten.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is, and Lohmeier pushes back against it.
I imagine he does. He seems pretty committed to those founding principles.
He is, and while acknowledging the nation's past struggles with racism, he argues that this narrative of America being inherently racist is ultimately harmful.
Harmful to the military specifically.
Especially to the military, he believes it can erode trust among service members and weaken that sense of shared purpose that's so crucial to their effectiveness.
He's worried about the potential for division and resentment within the ranks.
Exactly, and he also draws on Jordan Peterson's work here, specifically his book Maps of Meaning.
Now, what does Peterson have to do with all of this?
Well, Peterson explores the importance of shared narratives and myths in shaping human behavior and understanding.
So how does Lohmeier connect that to the military?
He uses Peterson's framework to explain the dangers of undermining those foundational narratives that bind people together, especially in a high-stakes environment like the military.
So he's saying that if you start messing with those shared beliefs, you risk destabilizing the whole system.
Precisely. And that leads him to the issue of declining morale and motivation for service within the military.
That's been a growing concern, hasn't it?
It has, and Lohmeier has witnessed it firsthand. He believes it's directly linked to what he calls the rise of wokeness.
Wokeness in the sense of...
In the sense of an overemphasis on identity politics,
Yeah.
on the narrative of systemic racism and oppression. And he argues that this narrative is creating a hostile environment for service members who hold more traditional values, those who don't necessarily subscribe to this worldview.
And it's leading to feelings of guilt and resentment, which further erodes morale.
Exactly. He even shares some pretty striking anecdotes from his own experience.
Like what?
He tells the story of a young man who told his sponsor family that the Air Force Academy is the last place on earth you want to be if you are a white Christian male.
Wow, that's pretty stark.
It is, and it reflects this growing sentiment that certain groups are being targeted, marginalized within the military.
And Lohmeier sees this as a direct result of those diversity and inclusion initiatives.
He does, especially when those initiatives are rooted in critical race theory, which he's very critical of.
And his main takeaway from all of this.
He believes that the military's focus on wokeness, as he calls it, is actually weakening its ability to defend the nation.
He sees it as a distraction, a diversion from the core mission.
Exactly. And he's worried that these internal divisions, this erosion of shared values, could have devastating consequences down the line.
So he's issuing a pretty serious warning here.
He is, and it's one that we should all pay attention to.
Lohmeier doesn't let up in Chapter 4. He calls it the Marxist conquest.
Yeah, here he really zeroes in on what he sees as a troubling trend.
The increasing acceptance, even promotion, of Marxist-influenced ideologies within the military.
He's particularly concerned about critical race theory, or CRT.
Which he believes is becoming more and more influential, especially in military training and education.
And to illustrate this point, he actually shares some examples from social media.
Social media posts by service members.
Yeah, posts that he considers woke, some even endorsing violence and revolution.
That's pretty extreme. I imagine that raised some red flags for Lohmeier.
It did. He was very alarmed by it. And what concerned him even more was the apparent lack of consequences.
So people are expressing these radical views and nothing's being done about it.
That's his perception. And it feeds into his larger argument about a dangerous double standard within the military.
How so?
Well, he contrasts this tolerance for radical views with his own experience.
Right. He was relieved of his command for speaking out against what he considered dangerous ideological trends.
Exactly. So on the one hand, you have people openly expressing support for revolution. And on the other hand, you have Lohmeier being punished for simply voicing concerns about those very ideas.
It does seem a bit ironic, doesn't it?
It does. And Lohmeier sees it as a sign that the military is becoming more tolerant of extremism while silencing dissent.
So he's making a case for free speech within the military, even when that speech challenges the status quo.
He is. And to further highlight this point, he brings in some commentary from Tucker Carlson.
Now, why Tucker Carlson?
Well, Lohmeier includes excerpts from a show Carlson did back in January of 2021.
What was the context?
Carlson was criticizing what he saw as the demonization of conservatives and Trump voters after the 2020 election.
So Lohmeier is drawing a parallel between that kind of rhetoric and the rhetoric he sees being used within the military.
Exactly. He sees this broader societal trend of demonizing and silencing those who hold certain views, and he's concerned about its impact on the military.
He's worried that it could lead to a climate of intolerance, maybe even violence, within the ranks.
Precisely. He sees it as a slippery slope, and he uses Carlson's commentary as a cautionary tale.
So Chapter 4 is really about raising the alarm, highlighting what Lohmeier perceives as a very dangerous trend.
It is, and in Chapter 5, Caught in the Whirlwind, he takes a bit of a detour into history.
A history lesson.
In a way, he explores the historical roots of Marxist ideology. He goes all the way back to the French Revolution.
That makes sense. The French Revolution was a pretty pivotal moment in terms of political upheaval and social change.
It was, and Lohmeier traces those threads of revolutionary thought from the French Revolution to the writings of Karl Marx.
And the Communist Manifesto, I presume?
Of course, he dives into Marx's concept of class struggle, the idea that history is driven by conflict between the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, and the proletariat, the working class.
It's a pretty fundamental idea in Marxist theory, isn't it?
It is. And Lohmeier also explores Marx's calls for the abolition of private property, the dismantling of traditional family structures, and the eventual goal of achieving a communist utopia.
A classless society free from oppression. That was the Marxist vision.
Exactly. But Lohmeier argues that these ideas, while they might sound appealing to some, have historically led to some pretty horrific outcomes.
Totalitarian regimes, violence, suppression of individual liberty, all of that.
All of that. He points to the horrors of the 20th century, to regimes like Stalin's Soviet Union and Mao's China, as evidence of the dangers of trying to put these ideas into practice.
So he's not just critiquing the theory, he's highlighting the real-world consequences of its implementation.
Right, he's making a case that these aren't just abstract philosophical concepts. They have very real and often very deadly implications.
And he doesn't stop there, does he?
He doesn't. He goes on to connect Marxist ideology with the rise of postmodernism and critical theory.
Now, how does he make that connection?
He sees these intellectual movements as having undermined traditional values, objective truth, and individual responsibility.
So they've created a cultural climate that's more receptive to Marxist ideas.
That's his argument. He believes they've shifted the focus away from reason and individual liberty towards a more relativistic and collectivist worldview.
And this leads him to his analysis of critical race theory, which he sees as a direct descendant of critical theory.
Exactly. He argues that CRT applies those same principles of deconstruction and power dynamics to the issue of race.
So instead of focusing on class struggle, it focuses on racial struggle.
Precisely. And he's very critical of CRT's core premise, the idea that racism is inherent in all aspects of American society.
And that white people are inherently oppressive, regardless of their intentions.
Right. He believes that this framework creates a culture of guilt and blame, that it divides people based on race, and ultimately hinders progress towards genuine equality.
It sounds like he sees CRT as a very destructive force.
He does. And he connects it to the rise of those diversity and inclusion training programs that we talked about earlier.
The ones that he believes are becoming increasingly prevalent within the military.
Exactly. He sees them as pushing the CRT narrative, and he worries that they're doing more harm than good.
Eroding unit cohesion, creating resentment, all of that.
All of that, and to illustrate his point, he even shares a personal anecdote about a Race in America book club he attended.
What book were they discussing?
So, you want to talk about Race? By Ijeoma Oluo.
And what did Lohmeier think of it?
He wasn't a fan. He found it inflammatory and divisive, and he argues that it actually exacerbates racial tensions rather than promoting understanding.
So he's saying that these kinds of initiatives, while they might be well-intentioned, are actually counterproductive.
That's his argument. And he ends Chapter 5 with a pretty stark warning.
What's that?
He believes that Marxist-influenced ideologies, often disguised under the banners of diversity, social justice, and inclusion, are gaining a foothold within the military.
And he's concerned about the long-term implications.
He is. He fears that if these trends continue, they will fundamentally transform the military, making it weaker and less capable of defending the nation.
So it's a pretty dire prediction.
It is. And it sets the stage for Chapter 6, once respected, now despised, where he really shifts gears.
In what way?
He moves away from analyzing the historical roots and theoretical underpinnings of Marxist ideology and starts focusing on the potential real-world consequences of its influence.
He wants to make it clear that these aren't just abstract ideas. They have very real and often very dangerous implications for individuals and societies.
Exactly. And to illustrate this point, he draws a chilling parallel to the horrors of the Chinese Cultural Revolution.
Now, that was a truly horrific period in history.
It was marked by violence, chaos, and widespread persecution.
Millions died, and countless others suffered unimaginable trauma.
Lohmeier doesn't shy away from the brutality of it all. He shares excerpts from Fan Shen's memoir, Gang of One, Memoirs of a Red Guard, which offers a first-hand account of the violence and brutality unleashed during that tumultuous period.
The Red Guards were those young people who were fanatically devoted to Mao Zedong's ideology, weren't they?
They were, and they were encouraged to attack anyone perceived as an enemy of the revolution, even their own family members and teachers.
It's hard to imagine the kind of social breakdown that would lead to something like that.
It is, and Lohmeier focuses on the tragic story of General Luo, a high-ranking military official who was publicly humiliated, tortured, and ultimately died during a Red Guard rally.
His description of the rally is incredibly disturbing. He really brings to life the cruelty and dehumanization inflicted upon General Luo by the Red Guards, driven by their fervent and unquestioning belief in Mao's ideology.
Lohmeier uses this historical example to highlight the dangers of ideological possession and the potential for violence and brutality when individuals are swept up in a mass movement that encourages them to see their fellow citizens as enemies.
He's not saying that America is on the verge of experiencing a cultural revolution, but he is drawing a connection between the rhetoric and tactics used by the Red Guards and the rhetoric and tactics being used by some groups in America today.
He's concerned about the demonization of certain groups, such as conservatives, white people, and Christians, and the increasing acceptance of violence and intimidation as legitimate forms of political expression.
So he sees these trends as warning signs that America could be heading down a dangerous path if we're not careful.
And in the final chapter, Chapter 7, Averting the Wrath to Come, he offers some thoughts on what can be done to prevent these potential pitfalls.
Because he's not just trying to scare people, he's also trying to offer some hope, some guidance on how to navigate these challenging times.
Exactly. And he begins by acknowledging that it's unlikely that political parties will suddenly undergo a collective repentance and abandon their ideological commitments.
So he's not holding his breath for some grand political solution.
No, he believes that the responsibility for resisting the encroachment of Marxist ideology rests on the shoulders of individuals, families, and communities.
So it's a call to action, a call for personal responsibility.
It is, and he offers some specific suggestions, starting with a return to truth, humility, and a belief in America's founding principles.
Back to basics, in a way.
In a way, he sees those principles as the antidote to the poison of Marxist ideology.
And he encourages readers to educate themselves about the dangers of Marxist ideology, to speak out against falsehoods, and to live by principles of integrity and respect.
He also draws inspiration from Alexander Solzhenitsyn's essay Live Not by Lies, which urged individuals to resist totalitarian regimes by refusing to participate in their systems of deception and control.
It's a powerful message about the importance of individual conscience and the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult.
Lohmeier believes that this principle is just as relevant today as it was during the Cold War. He sees a new form of ideological tyranny emerging, one that seeks to control our thoughts, beliefs, and even our language.
It's a tyranny of political correctness, where certain ideas and opinions are deemed unacceptable, and those who express them are silenced or ostracized.
And he concludes his book with a powerful call to action, urging readers to stand for what is right, to be courageous in the face of opposition, and to never give up hope for a better future.
So Lohmeier ends on a hopeful note, despite all the warnings.
He does. He believes that we can resist these negative trends, but it takes individual effort.
It's not going to happen from the top down.
He's not counting on any grand political solutions.
It's up to each of us to make a difference.
To stand up for those core principles that he values so much.
And that brings us to a really important question for our listeners.
What do you think? If Lohmeier is right, and this ideology is pervasive as he claims, how do we even recognize it?
I mean, it's not always going to be these blatant calls for revolution.
Right, it's probably going to be much more subtle, more insidious.
How do we spot it in our everyday lives?
That's the challenge, isn't it? We're constantly bombarded with information, narratives coming from all directions.
It can be hard to filter through all the noise.
To discern what's genuine, what's manipulative, what aligns with our own values.
It takes real effort, real critical thinking.
It does. We can't just passively absorb everything we hear and see.
We have to be willing to question things, to challenge our own assumptions.
And to engage with different perspectives, even those we might find uncomfortable.
Because that's how we grow. That's how we avoid falling into these ideological traps.
And it all starts with understanding our own values. What do we stand for?
What principles guide our actions, our decisions?
Once we have a solid foundation, a moral compass, so to speak,
we're better equipped to navigate this complex world.
To make informed choices, to resist those influences that might lead us astray.
Lohmeier is really calling for a revival of personal responsibility, isn't he?
He is. He wants people to be active participants, not passive consumers.
To shape their own destinies, not be shaped by someone else's ideology.
To think for themselves. To speak the truth.
Even when it's difficult, even when it's unpopular.
That's what Solzhenitsyn meant by live not by lies.
It's about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when you're facing opposition.
To be a beacon of light, a force for good in the world.
And to never give up hope, to keep fighting for a better future.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today in our deep dive into Irresistible Revolution.
It's been a whirlwind tour through some pretty heavy topics.
We've explored Lohmeier's concerns about the 1619 Project, the influence of Marxist ideology, the importance of those founding principles.
We've delved into history, philosophy, personal anecdotes.
We've even touched on those criticisms and the controversy surrounding his book.
It's a book that's designed to provoke, to make you think.
And whether you agree with Lohmeier or not, there's no denying he raises some important questions.
Questions about the direction of our society, the role of ideology in shaping our institutions, the importance of individual responsibility.
And if you're intrigued by what you've heard today,
We encourage you to check out Irresistible Revolution for yourself.
read it with an open mind, think critically about the arguments.
And most importantly, engage in those tough conversations.
With respect, with a willingness to listen and learn.
Because that's how we make progress. That's how we build a better future together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you.
And we look forward to continuing the conversation in future episodes.